South Africa hopes that the International Court of Justice orders on Israel will be implemented. That's according to the International Relations and Cooperation Director General Zane Dangor. The University of KwaZulu Natal School of Law is now hosting a symposium on international law South Africa. And the question of Palestine as well. Former UN Human Rights Commissioner Judge Navi Pillay, academics and various legal experts are all taking part. Khayelihle Khumalo, in fact, joins us in studio for more. Kai, good afternoon. Thanks for your time at this hour.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, in view of what's transpiring today, walk us through what some of the sentiments have been reflected by the experts. One of the experts saying South Africa was justified in taking Israel to the International Court of Justice. Perhaps you could tell us more about that.
Well, that's right, Liesl. So that has been a very dominant issue, yes. Dissecting the ruling itself, looking at why South Africa decided to go to this global court, the UN legal organ, in terms of making sure that Israel is able to meet its obligations when it comes to the Genocide Convention, but also, most importantly, looking at the motivations, with South Africa, the issue of Palestine, at least with the ANC government since 1994, they've been very consistent in terms of their support for Palestine. And it's just quite interesting that, for example, South Africa was absolutely justified in making sure that Israel is held accountable. But of course, now the million-dollar question is, what will happen to these orders? Will Israel comply? Will it make sure that there is a conducive environment in Gaza in terms of the humanitarian aid, in terms of making sure that there is less, actions that may lead to a genocide? And in fact, Liesl, one of the experts really addressed this symposium, and I think it's quite important if I may take a listen to him.
South Africa was justified. It was entitled to do it. It had an obligation to do something, and doing this was within its right as a sovereign state. It seems to me that the objections that are made to South Africa taking this case, the criticism that has been mounted, is not really legal criticism, but ideological, political, and emotional criticism. Ideological because there are some states and some organisations that are so committed to the Israeli government that they will not brook any criticism whatsoever. Political, because these events are occurring in a broad geopolitical space where other states are making decisions that are sometimes confusing or confounding even.
So, of course, those are some sentiments by Chrissy Doty. And so as we look at some of the dynamics unfolding, people are questioning the implications from here into for South Africa. We even understand that some of its trading partners, or our trading partners, are against the move. Where to from here now?
Well, that's right, Liesl. For example, when you look at the United States of America, they said this is meritless. They were saying South Africa is overreacting by going to the ICJ. And we do know that, you go back to November last year, where the AGOA, that preferential trade agreement between the sub-Saharan Africa and the US, we know that it's still up in the air. The Congress must decide. You still have some Congress people who are saying South Africa should be booted out, because one of the very critical issues that they always raise is that if the US interests are in any way affected, and we do know of the relations between the US and Israel, they've been the chief backer supplying the weapons, the artillery, and the warships moving across the Mediterranean. But also the issue of the AGOA. One of the speakers in UK, Zane, said this may really have major repercussions for South Africa, especially because of the economic interest. You have some people already who are withdrawing their funding here in South Africa, but also their business interest as well. But, in as far as the Department of International Relations is concerned, DG Dangor said South Africa is working on these issues in terms of managing these relations. But also we saw on the eve of the judgment from the ICJ, where the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, Foreign Minister Pandey, where they had an interaction reaffirming South Africa's sound relations with the US, but also looking at the issue of the Gaza Strip in terms of the supply of the humanitarian aid. But obviously, when it comes to the judgment itself, the US just said, well, they welcome it, and they said this is something that they have been mentioning for some time.
No, absolutely, because We're also looking at the role of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. They're part of the symposium as well. And so as we look at who is on the panel and what's also said to be reflected, what comes through on that front?
I think it's quite a lot of issues, Liesl. I mean, for example, quite a number of experts looking at South Africa-Israel diplomatic relations, and also others go as far as saying that you have these relations. And as we know that we've seen South African Parliament calling for the diplomatic ties to be cut off. Of course, the executive will have to decide on that particular issue. But obviously, it's quite a number of issues that are being raised, especially because we know that this is a very thorny issue internationally, but also the department itself. They say that they were very justified in going to this important court, especially because there are so many obligations that must be fulfilled in this regard. But also for South Africa, it's a matter of moral authority in terms of making sure that they save the people of Gaza who are facing the constant bombardment. But once again, Lisa, let's take a listen to the DG for the Department of Decor.
We feel that the judgment is good. It's important if one looks at the judgment and the manner in which the president of the court outlined the judgment, made the case very clearly for the fact that there is a plausible case for genocide, which then gives rise to the fact that these orders were given. Much is being made about there not being a ceasefire. Our application didn't use the word ceasefire, but of course we asked for the end of all the military action that was giving rise to the genocidal harm. And we think we did achieve that. If one looks at the first order combined with the second order, where the first order outlines all the provisions of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, and then the injunction to the Israeli government to order the IDF to stop all actions that will be in contravention of Article 2. And in combination with all the other provisions, we do not think that the judges did not intend for basically instructing Israel to oblige by its duties to end the harm by its current military means. So I thought that is important for us to bring from a messaging perspective into this discussion and other discussions.
On the back of what the DG echoed, perhaps as we also look at what transpired, developing world versus the developed world, we're having to look at how they're going to uphold democratic ideals also going forward. What do you think is reflected in South Africa's agency, perhaps even for the continent in the shifting geopolitical landscape?
I think what has been really fascinating to watch from UKZN Symposium really are the experts when they say that it's quite important to factor in that this is literally South Africa versus the major powers, the US, the UK, Germany, and other very influential countries, but also speaking to the geopolitical shift that we're seeing, where the world order really is changing. And it's quite important because it's all about making sure that it's reinforced as a multipolar world, but also, most importantly, to make sure that if they talk about human rights, we really see the unequivocal application of these international laws as opposed to applying the laws selectively. I think that's a very important issue that a lot of them they're raising in this regard. But also, apart from that, I think now the critical issue is that what's going to happen now to these orders? Yes. Will Israel make sure that they do comply, especially in the context of what has been happening lately? In spite of the ICJ rulings, we have seen some of the cabinet ministers from Israel really continuing with some of the inflammatory remarks, really just seeing this culture of impunity, that a lot of things are happening. But also, Lisa, what is very sad in this regard is that as much as we have this ruling at hand as well, and a lot of critics have been saying the issue of saying perhaps the ceasefire should have been more prominent in terms of the judgment, as opposed to really just living up to the conditions that should be conducive for the aid to be delivered. It was quite important for the ICJ really to make it quite precise. But also apart from that, in terms of making sure that we see the people of Gaza really surviving what is a very, very incredibly tough chapter.
It's going to be interesting to see how our elections run and how this issue, this policy comes to the fore amongst opposition parties even. What are you observing on that front very quickly as we wrap up?
Well, that's right, especially because we know this is a hot potato. You do have those parties who are really in favor of South African government, who are saying this is a very good choice. But then you have those who are deeply opposed to this stance. So they're saying, look, Israel has got a right to self-defense, but also in uprooting the military capabilities of Hamas. So definitely it's going to be a very major factor.
Khaya, that symposium is finishing at 6 p.m. and I know you're bringing us the latest there. We'll leave our conversation there for now, continue to listen there and obviously get the latest as it emerges. But thank you for joining us in studio at